Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 again, and we're going to start. Okay, one of the themes that we have been discussing in Matthew is how Jesus is preparing the disciples for when he goes away, and he's preparing the disciples basically to lead the church because that's the new form of the kingdom that's coming to the earth. Or that's the form of worshiping Jesus until the kingdom comes to the earth. Um, None of these disciples, of course, were trained for anything, nor had they aspired to be trained to be a minister of any kind. But that was God's plan. God's plan was to get a fisherman, a tax collector, and a teenager and get them to basically start the church that you and I are a part of today. Isn't that incredible when you think about that? A tax collector, a fisherman, of course, more than one fisherman, and a teenager. Do y'all know who the teenager was? Who lived the longest? John. It was John. Mm-hmm. He was a teenager. So he's preparing them to make them equal to the challenge. God calls unqualified people to serve him, but he doesn't leave them untrained. The challenge is when God does training, it's not particularly at a seminary. He trains them by life, and he trains us through life experience as well. And that's, and you know, we call that trials a lot of times because when do you learn the most? When you're on the mountaintop or when you're digging through the valley, you know? So plus their only example of clergy of any kind was the Pharisaic Judaism. And they focused more on the Mishnah than they did on the Word of God. Do y'all know what the Mishnah is? It's the rules that the Pharisees wrote to make sure that you followed God's rules, except they many times distorted God's rules, but they followed them more than they followed God's rules. And in fact, anytime you hear the Pharisees tell Jesus, you broke the law, Jesus never broke God's law, but he broke the Mishnah law repeatedly and sometimes on purpose.
Broke that man's law.
That's right. And like I said, sometimes on purpose, just to prove a point, but boy, did it make them fire mad. So we know that the Pharisees were basically unloving and legalistic. And you know, it's easy when you're legalistic to be unloving because what are you if you're legalistic a lot of times? Judgmental towards others. And usually, you know where we're judgmental at? It's that very area where we kind of got it down. So we could look at other people and go, you know, they're wrong. Sometimes we're at it's the very area we have wrong, but we don't want anybody to know we have it wrong. Anyway, so Jesus's approach to ministry had never been seen before. And what we're going to look at tonight is the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is instituting this as a teaching moment. And y'all, this was not an easy moment. You know, when you read through it, it's like, oh, wow, God did all this, da, 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 da. But boy, this has really dug in and showed me a lot more about it. So let's read Matthew 14:13.
Okay. Now, when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves."
Okay. The last time we were together, we talked about that Herod made it plain that John the Baptist had been executed because of his little dancing friend. And so Jesus wanted to grieve, and so he went away. He said he withdrew so that he could just have some time to himself. And the disciples had been ministering to the crowd all day long, so he suggested that they go somewhere where they could have a little rest. We know that he had just been in Nazareth when he heard about John's death, And we know that he's somewhere around Capernaum at this time. We know that when he comes back to where they started, it's at Capernaum. You know how he comes back to Capernaum? He walks on water. So that'll be our next week's lesson. Jesus uses the opportunity he uses, like I said, this opportunity as a teaching miracle, if you will. This miracle is unique in that it is in all four Gospels, and it's the only miracle that's in all four Gospels other than the resurrection. So that means it was pretty important because they all recorded it. Y'all excuse me a minute. Get my jacket off. So we know that this impressed the disciples a good bit. They were exhausted. Like I said, they'd been ministering to people all day, and they were just really tired. Mark 6:31 says,
And he said to them, Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not have time to eat. They went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves.
Okay. They went to the eastern side of the Galilee. The eastern side of the Galilee is the Gentile side of Galilee. And they didn't, as Jews, didn't go there very often. And as a matter of fact, the Jewish people didn't go there pretty much at all. Jesus occasionally went there to rest. The last time we saw Jesus in this area was when he delivered the man with no clothes from the tombs. Remember when we talked about the man full of demons? So that's the last time we saw him in this area. But anyway, Jesus and the disciples went by boat, and they went on the border between the east and west. And for that reason, the crowd followed them because they didn't go deep into the east side, the Gentile side. So they went on the border to a town called Bethsaida. It's a little fishing village. So they went on the boat, but then the crowd walked around on the shore. It was only about 5 miles to walk around on the shore. So a couple of hours walk for them to get there. Jesus and the disciples got there a little bit earlier, but not really early enough to get a good rest or a good meal. The crowd arrived shortly behind them. This whole occurrence occurred at the time of Passover. And that's important because we're going to see similarities between this instance of feeding the 5,000 and the events in Exodus of the Passover. So, like I said, Jesus uses this comparison to compare to Exodus, this event. When Moses led a group of Jews, he went through a body of water, the Red Sea. He went into Gentile territory without food or water. When Moses got there, he ascended up a mountain, leaving the people down below. People got hungry. They started complaining. So Moses called down manna from heaven. So let's compare this to this story that we're looking at right now. Like Moses, Jesus crossed a body of water, in this case, the Sea of Galilee, to reach a Gentile territory, a little near Bethsaida. A large crowd of Jews followed behind him, just like the large crowd followed behind Moses out of Egypt. Jesus retreated up a mountainside, leaving the crowd, and it's getting toward evening. And guess what? They're hungry. When they seek food, he will feed them miraculously with bread from heaven. And of course, we know that Jesus is considered to be the bread of life. So the disciples must come to what Jesus wants to teach the disciples, though, is that in order to get supplied, they must go to him repeatedly to keep supplied. Had y'all ever seen those similarities between those two stories?
No.
Me either. It's like, it is almost verbatim. I feel like I'm back in Ruth. Remember all those repeated stories of Ruth,
Black history repeating itself.
So Jesus saw saw a large crowd below, and he had compassion on them. This is very important because he said, and he healed their sick. Y'all remember at the end of chapter 12, he stopped healing the crowds. He only healed those who showed faith. But I want you to see this is an exception to that rule. It said he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So he broke his rule. In other words, his love for them compelled him to heal the sick. I was thinking about that today. Jesus never changes. So it made me wonder how many times today, when there's fires in Los Angeles, when there's hurricanes in North Carolina, how many times does he have compassion and heal or reach out to people, even those who are not saved? Because I've always learned that only if you're saved is he going to do something for you. But perhaps that's, perhaps, anyway, this made me think there may be more to the story, because he had compassion on them and they were not saved. They didn't have faith in him, but he healed them. Because those fires are nothing compared to hell's fires. So we will see it again when it says he had compassion on them, and we will see him heal again in this chapter, is my understanding. I haven't seen it yet. Okay, so there's times that Jesus will choose to act against that pattern that he has set down of only healing those who had faith. So the evening is approaching, and the disciples look at the huge crowd, and they start being concerned that they wouldn't be able to minister to them if they all got hungry. How many men were there in this crowd? There were 5,000 men in this crowd. There were also women and children. It's estimated there were between 15 and 20,000 people in this crowd. That is a lot of people to get hungry at the same time, and hangry, huh? So they were concerned, I'm sure, that discontent could arise among the crowd. The disciples' way to solve the problem was to suggest that to Jesus, make the crowds go away to a nearby town so they can get themselves some food. Well, all there was that little Bethsaida. There wasn't much food there. But anyway, their choice of words, they said, send the crowds away. They're thinking, it may sound like they were being compassionate to the people, but probably it was more that they were thinking like the Pharisees, that, hey, we've been ministering to these people all day long. Look at them. They're just causing us, they could cause us a lot more trouble than they are now. Jesus, tell them just to go away. Tell them to go find their own food. We don't want their, a burden from them. Who were the disciples thinking of at that moment? Themselves. Do y'all ever think of yourself when you're doing ministry? Let's all just close our eyes and hide our face. Yes, there are times when we're doing ministry with other people, especially when we get crossways with somebody, and my feelings are hurt, and I get upset sometimes. And so, but the disciples were looking at themselves, and remember, they had had a pretty long day up to this point, and
they're hungry too.
Yeah, and it only gets longer, I promise you. So, in view of a possible problem, the disciples saw potential that there was going to be problems, and they wanted Jesus to fix it. The crowd had come with the hope, desire, and needs. And that's what ministry is founded on, people with hope, desire, and needs. The disciples just saw the crowd as just a whole bunch of burdens out there. And I don't know about y'all, but there are times in churches where you see somebody coming and you just kind of want to go the other way because of either your relationship with them or because they're always real needy. They always need, and they always suck you dry. They need something from you. It feels that way. Yes. Wait till you hear what our lesson says about that. Anyway, The disciples' attitude kind of reminds us of clerks that we find, especially in DMV offices. They are rude. You know how when you go in and you feel like you're intruding or interrupting their day. How dare you?
must be getting rude.
It's funny how not only ours and Dorita is like that, right?
Right, but you know what? The one in DeQuincy is not like that.
No,
You want to
no,
be treated
no,
well,
either.
go to DeQuincy.
Those are Quincy, that's a nice lady down
It
And
is.
these
She
people
always
always
has
had good experiences.
She's
there.
overworked too.
I mean, she's wonderful, and she's a Christian. But anyway,
Mm.
but when the customer is the only reason they have a job is because we go in there and disturb and interrupt them. Well, with a shepherd, it's because of the flocks that a shepherd has a job and a reason to minister. And so a shepherd's heart doesn't hold the flock's weak need to recognize the weaknesses as being the very reason that they are sent to minister. Now, remember what I said a minute ago about what about the people that we come across that we want to turn and go the other way? They may be the very reason that we are to minister in that situation. Okay? And it's not the easy ones, y'all. It's the tough ones. It's the hard ones. It's the ones that you really do want to avoid. Okay?
Like that old saying is, you keep your friends close and your enemies close.
Yes.
And that works.
The Bible teaches that the more needs that exist in the body, the better it is for the body. Now, I have never heard that or never understood that before, but 1 Corinthians 12:21.
And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, or again to the head or to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, it's much truer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary, and those members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it.
So the members of our corporate body that seem to be weaker, it says, are actually necessary. You mean God allows weaker members to come into our bodies and they are necessary? These are the ones that are hard to love, perhaps less spiritually mature. Perhaps they carry a lot of sin baggage. They irritate us. They say the wrong things. But these are not problems to be sent away. These are children of God to be ministered to. And look, he says they are due even greater honor. Receiving greater honor here means that they receive a greater share of ministry. And you have to give them more ministry, because if not, they squawk a lot louder, right? They invest. We must invest self-sacrificially to minister to them. And guess what happens when we invest ourselves self-sacrificially? We are rewarded. Our rewards in heaven, our treasure in heaven grows. Now, we talked about rewards several times lately, and y'all weren't here for this, but what I think we've discovered, and tell me if y'all have different views. My view is that God is constantly looking for places to reward us. Kind of like, you go work at a job and you get rewarded with a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
Our whole world kind of operates on that. Well, God too is looking at us, and he's just wanting to go, high five, you did it, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
Yay. Except the way he does it is he stores up treasures for us in heaven. And I think it's every time we get it. Why do I say it's every time? There was the example of, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, but your Father in heaven sees what you're doing and will reward you. To me, that's saying he's looking what we're doing all the time to reward us. And there's also that verse about, even if you give a glass of water to the little one, if he's looking at those things as reward, to me, he's looking at everything to reward our obedience. And so what we're being rewarded for is obedience. And we're not working. I don't think we're working for the reward as much as we're working for the common goal. And the common goal is to worship God and please Him. And when we do that, we are going to get treasure in heaven. We're going to get rewards. So,
And that's why it's so hard whenever we're not feeling patience and we're not feeling, and we have to get out of situations. Why it's so devastating to me that I'm not sacrificing to tolerate and do what I feel like I should do.
yeah.
And instead of my mouth overloading me, that's why I just leave the situations. But it makes me feel
I think that
sad because I didn't do it. I didn't.
perhaps, Donette, and not knowing the situation, but perhaps God had you leave that situation. Perhaps,
Yeah.
because there are times, like you said, if my mouth is going to dishonor God, I need to get out of Dodge. Okay.
Yeah. And she
And
might say something that may hurt him.
and then maybe you can come, and maybe God will send back another opportunity where you can truly be a minister with the right heart and attitude. But first of all, you got to get a little healing, because obviously I've been hurt in church. I've been hurt in church a lot. I even have witnesses, huh, Kim? And John and Mom. But I have to step back and let God minister to me so that I can be whole enough to be able to handle it. And I mean, there's been 2 or 3 occasions when I've had to step back, but the next time I encountered that person, and I just would say, God, I don't even want to see this person, much less talk to him. And He would talk to that person through my body and say, hi, how you doing? And just be
Yeah.
who He was, not who I was, because I'm still seething inside, but He ministered.
Yeah.
Seeing John's ex-wife at a party a couple of months ago. Did I tell y'all about that?
Mm-mm.
Well, I saw her, and we've never gotten along ever. And not because I wouldn't get along. In other words, it was her fault. No. I felt like it was anyway. But anyway, when she came to talk to me at this party, and I did not have this plan, I just said, hey, give me a hug. Can you believe that? And let me tell you, it was a wonderful time.
Mhm.
And I got a hug and we moved on. Well, that was not Danielle's plan. Okay. My plan was to avoid her.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's what God can do when we least expect it. Okay. Anyway, so you might, like I said, not knowing different situations, every one of them are different. And I think God
But I
can
think
use.
that's what
This is what
I
we
was
aspire
thinking
to.
about. Exactly.
This is
Okay.
what
There you
we,
go. That's
yes,
what we
this is
aspire
where
to.
we're working to look like Jesus. And this is where we don't always make the mark.
Right.
But, that's our goal, is to make the mark. Girl, y'all know how I was a couple of weeks ago. I told y'all. Sometimes I get mad at me for being so transparent because I'm thinking I'm so embarrassed by myself. But anyway, okay, so we know that these people get more honor because they get more service from everybody, and that we know that investment will pay us dividends in heaven. Okay, and that's what we aspire to. We aspire to do the right thing. God gives ministers great opportunity for reward, and at the same time, the opportunity strengthens the weaker member. So you see how that's twofold blessing? He's strengthening the weak member, the one that is not maybe spiritually mature, and he's strengthening us, or we're saying that we're the stronger member, those who are trying to minister to them. So it's a twofold ministry there. Paul says weaker members give us purpose to our spiritual gifts, and they are our customers, and we are the clerk that is assigned to them spiritually. Okay. And I'm thinking, yes, Father, there's still a couple of people I don't want to come to my Sunday school class because when there's been an occasion in my Sunday school class for people to come in and you can tell that mentally they are incapacitated, but they kind of come in and they take over the whole class with conversation,
Oh.
and my job is to teach, to minister to them, maybe even more so than I'm ministering to everybody else, but to keep the class going too. And sometimes that's challenging. And I'm just using that as an example. But they are our customers too. And I have to tell myself that because I wanted to say, hush.
Yeah.
Anyway, so actually these weaker members could be your very gift from heaven, from God, to strengthen you. And Paul and the commentator says that we will gain far more from serving the weaker member than the weaker member receives from us. How about that? And we know that because these are hard times. These are not easy times, and they do require self-sacrifice. When we minister to people who have rough edges, it is then we truly learn how to love someone the way Christ loves us, self-sacrificially. And y'all, we know these. It's just never been quite so pointed to us, Sometimes, and it says, and sometimes we are that unlovable person with sharp edges, and we are. How hard is it for you to receive ministry from someone? I'm asking that for a reason. I'm looking at a group of people that are, for the most part, pretty self-sufficient. They like to take care of their own needs and take care of themselves and be self-sufficient.
Probably hard-headed.
And the deal is, God may want somebody to minister to us, and we do not need to rob them from that privilege of doing so. Because why do we not let them do it? Huh?
Well, okay, don't let me be that person that you need to make quiet for the last.
Not at all.
I have a little story.
Okay.
Whenever I was diagnosed with cancer, someone very close to me didn't want to tell. Let's not tell. Let's keep it quiet and all that. And then after going through this, and I see now, huge mistake for me, not letting certain people, letting people know, because I was not giving them an opportunity to support me in it. That blessed them too. And that was another big thing I got out of it. You know how I mentioned, I
Right.
always wondered what was that about? And
Right.
that was the hugest thing. That sharing with others was the biggest thing,
Uh-huh.
and accepting their prayers and their support and all that, which I very desperately needed.
Yeah.
And because I took that away from them, and that's how hard-headed and we're self-sufficient can be.
Right. Well, and it's a pride issue is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, they might not do it the way I want them to do it. Okay, sometimes we're picky.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that was a big lesson that you learned.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hear you. It's sometimes hard for us to do. So remember, these people, these new disciples, are actually disciples to the Messiah, and they've kind of figured out he really is the Messiah. Okay, not fully, but kind of. They figured out that he's the Messiah. And so they may have thought, well, now that since I'm following this Messiah and we're in his inner circle, we're probably going to get some extra privileges here. And the reason they may have thought that was because the Pharisees thought perceived their role as a minister, thinking this way: I'm the model Jew. I sacrifice, I study, I tithe, I devote endless hours to purity and holiness. I'm God's representative to the Jewish people. Just as men are blessed to receive God's fellowship, so are the Jewish people privileged to receive my ministry. Just as the Lord receives praise and glory and honor for his wisdom, so I should be praised and honored among the people. So that was their example of clergy. And that's the only example they had. And so for them to think, hey, I'm in Jesus's inner circle, I should kind of be all that too. That wasn't that foreign, okay? But this attitude is called lording over people. Exercising dominion over someone, expecting them to respond with homage. That was a new word for me, homage. Homage means special honor. Expecting them to give them special honor and obedience. Okay, Mark 20:25.
But Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Okay, ministers are not to be lord over people, but rather they are to serve people. And the Greek word translated for a minister is diakonos, which can also be translated as slave. Now, the elders and pastors and ministers were not to be slaves to the people, but they were to serve them. And he doesn't mean they were even supposed to do the bidding of the flock, but they also were not supposed to hoard their authority over them either. They were not to adopt a haughty, self-serving attitude, serving their own interest, but they were to serve the interest of the flock. To do that required humility and sacrifice, not the other way around. The Pharisees, we know, had a sense of entitlement. And we know the disciples battled with that some too. Do y'all remember when they said, "Can we sit next to you? Can we sit next to you?" Okay, they all wanted to sit next to Jesus and be in the place of honor. And that is the opposite of what Jesus teaches. So let's see, Matthew 14:16.
But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away, and you give them something to eat." And they said to him, We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Ordering the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking upward toward heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. There was about 5,000 men who ate, besides the women and children.
Okay, look what Jesus says in the very beginning. They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. I am sure they looked out over that crowd of 20,000 people and thought, huh?
Yeah.
Remember, had they had a long day already? Yes, they had had a long day already.
Big bread, big fish.
So literally, Jesus was telling them they have no need to go away. You feed them. He put the burden of being a shepherd on these disciples to shepherd the flock. And we know that on their own power, there's no way they could feed them, especially 15 to 20,000 people. Andrew had noticed there was a young boy who was selling fish and loaves, and he had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But these items could not have fed a crowd of 20,000. Our first response when we're called to ministry should not be how. And I'm thinking, boy, that was probably always my first response. How? But our first response should be, does God want this to happen? And if God wants to minister to somebody in a certain way, then he's going to provide the way. So our first response should be, yes, Lord, I'm willing to minister in this way. This reminds me of a mission trip that John and I took 24 youth on to North Dakota. And on the way, our van that we had rented, our bus that we had rented, broke down. And so it is a hot summer. But anyway, it broke down, and where it broke down, there was in a place where a bunch of Indians lived. And out in the field were a bunch of Indian children, and I say children, teenagers, children, and they were shooting fireworks. And so I had this group of 24 kids, and I said, hey, y'all, our buses broke down, but there's 24 people out there that need to know about Jesus. I said, so y'all just need to go and start talking to them. And while we were there, the police stopped by and they said, what are y'all doing? And we said, well, we're broke down. And I said, but what's going on is my students are out there talking to the Indian students and telling them about Jesus. And he said, that won't do any good. They're not going to listen to any of that. You know, his attitude was just, how many people got saved that day? It was over 5 and less than 15, okay? Made a profession of faith that day. And, you know, and so that's an instance of not how, but does God want us to minister? You know, because I promise I would not have chosen those circumstances in a hot summer. Okay. So the ministry is fundamentally I thought this was an interesting statement. Ministry is fundamentally about doing things that are impossible, humanly speaking. I'm going to put that in a frame of something we've just been talking about. Ministry is fundamentally about doing things that are impossible, humanly speaking, even like overcoming our attitude with certain situations. Y'all, it has to be spiritual, not just on our own power. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I mean, where is the biggest battle that we all fight? It's between our 2 ears. That's the battle. If we could win that battleground between our 2 ears, so many other battles would be won. So our first question should not be how, but what does God want in this situation? In other words, accept the challenge. Because if we ask how, we inevitably come up with a plan. And whose plan is it if we come up with a plan? It's our plan. Exactly right. And so we're looking to human plans to solve the problem. Andrew had seen the little boy with a little bit of food, but he knew that couldn't meet the problem. Jesus didn't save us so that we could come and solve his problems. Jesus didn't save us to solve his problems. He gives us an opportunity to minister so that he can solve problems through us. And we allow him to do the heavy lifting. Not only does the work get done, also we grow and the people grow. And God receives the glory for both accomplishments, providing ministry and growing us. The disciples were so focused on solving the problem, they could only think about how to do it in their own way. So Jesus is reminding them that shepherds are supposed to work. How shepherds are supposed to work. They're supposed to feed the sheep, but they're not supposed to have to supply the food, their own food. We need to remember that if the sheep were capable of feeding themselves, they wouldn't need a shepherd. Okay? Shepherds don't cause the grass to grow on a hillside. The shepherds do lead the sheep to places where the Lord has already prepared the grass for them. So as we apply that, our job as ministers is to lead people to where they can be fed spiritually. we are to act as conduits to supply to bring the Lord's supply to the people. So after Jesus set the disciples' mind on feeding the crowd, he begins to show the disciples how to do it. And the first thing he does is he tells everybody to sit down. They were told to sit down in groups, Mark says in Mark's gospel, in groups of hundreds and fifties. And so these are set down in small, manageable groups. Notice that God is structuring this environment. And God is not a God of confusion. So that's a pretty normal thing to happen. As a matter of fact, if a whole bunch of hungry people saw the food coming, they would have overwhelmed the disciples and grabbed the food, scared they wouldn't have gotten any. But because he organized it, that gave some confidence that everybody was going to get fed. Perhaps Jesus was reflecting on Psalms 23 when he had them sit down. As the crowds, the shepherd is the one who caused the sheep to lie down in green pastures. The shepherd cares for his sheep and makes sure they receive the rations. Isn't that a beautiful picture? So he had them sit down, just like in Psalms 23. So Jesus reveals and testifies to the fact that Jesus is the shepherd of Psalms 23, the one who cares for the sheep. Jesus gives thanks for the food and the miracles about to follow. He breaks the bread and divides the fish out. And where does he give the fish? To the disciples' hands, and the disciples are to go and feed the sheep. As the process continued, the people ate. No one was left wanting, and everybody got fed. How many hours do you think it took to feed that many people? Now, Jesus was stationed up on the hill. So the disciples, to fill their baskets, had to climb up the hill, get their basket full, go back down, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. They had to return to Jesus each time to get their basket filled. So they didn't actually see the fish being multiplied or the bread being multiplied. They just knew their basket got filled when they got there. Jesus was teaching his disciples what serving him in the kingdom will look like every day. He supplies the miracle to his people through the hands of his servants, but he requires the disciples to return to him to fill their baskets. Y'all, I wonder how often we fill our baskets in the middle of ministry, or do we just kind of get started and go on our own? You know what I'm saying? How much do we go to Jesus to be filled so that we can continue? If Jesus' priority had been efficiency, he would have walked down the hill, put a big old mound of fish and a big old mound of bread and said, hop to it and get in a line. No, he probably said, line up and feed yourself. But he intentionally distributed the food inefficiently so that he could teach this lesson to the disciples. The disciples' success depended on them continually returning to Jesus to fill their baskets. The disciples returned to Jesus, and then they had something they could offer the people. Had they not gone to him, they wouldn't have had anything to give them. And they would have run out something useful to give the people. So not only were the disciples unable to find a solution on their own in the beginning, neither could they sustain the ministry. So if we don't go back to Jesus, we can't sustain a ministry after it's begun. Even after Jesus gave them the solution and the work began, they did not possess the power to keep the work going. They had to go back, because the miracle was happening with Jesus, they had to go back and get filled. They had to go receive that which was valuable and then bring it to the people, one nugget at a time. We may not see the work we do for Jesus as a miracle. The disciples didn't really see it as a miracle at that time either. All they saw was their basket was being filled. And I mean, they knew something was going on here, but I'm not sure if their attitude was such that they could even perceive how good things were going on here, because guess what? They're dead dog tired.
Yep.
They got 20,000 people and they're having to go up and down the hill, up and down the hill, up and down the hill. You can just hear John saying, couldn't you meet us halfway, Jesus? Bring us the supplies. There's a better way to do this. Oh, I'm thinking of myself because I'm pretty good at looking at a situation and go, there's a better way to do this.
Slide it to me.
Yeah, my hips hurting too bad on that hill.
So when we serve someone in a moment with a prayer or a teaching or an encouraging word, it may not feel like a miracle is taking place at that moment. But if we step back and see the cumulative effect of all the things that Jesus does through our moments of service, we may then start observing a miracle. But it may not feel like it at the time. We see the multitude that Jesus fed through, maybe later we will see the multitude that Jesus feeds through our hands. And Jesus will rightly receive the glory for that. Ministry is hard work. Ministry is hard work. Jesus wanted the disciples to see that true ministry is hard work. How many times have you felt like, oh, I just can't go anymore? Or how about this? I'm just not going to go anymore. I'm done. I'm full to the brim. I'm the only one doing this. Why can't other people see the need? I mean, I'm just trying to think of the things I've thought through the years. Why can't they see? But serving Jesus in ministry is a great privilege and a joy, and we know that too. Sometimes it feels very lonely, difficult, sometimes gut-wrenching. But Jesus says, if you're going to put your hand to the plow, don't look back. So in other words, he wants us to know it is hard work, and don't get in the middle of it and look back and go, oh, I just better step out. After the crowd had been fed, Jesus then, to add insult to injury, he didn't fill the disciples a basket and give it to them. You know what he made them do? He made them go back down to the crowd and pick up the leftovers. Well, y'all, probably those people had stashed those leftovers because they had to walk home. They probably weren't ready to just easily give the leftovers back to the disciples. But Jesus made them go get it from the crowd, the leftovers. And when they picked it up, they picked up 12 baskets of leftovers, enough for each disciple. By doing that, the crowd actually got to bless those who had ministered to them. They got to give the blessing back. Where did the initial blessing come from? From Jesus. It went out to the sheep to be ministered to, and then the sheep were able to bless those who had ministered to them. So the provision was from God. 12 baskets. When you think of the number 12, what do you think of? The disciples, also the 12 tribes of Israel. So the whole of Israel. Everyone is blessed through the hands of someone else. And so everyone was blessed in that day. Also, did you notice the number of fish and loaves? 5 fish and 2 loaves. What's that number equal to? 7. What does 7 stand for? Complete. So everybody was completely filled. Okay? And completely ministered to. Also 5, and we don't know this one as well, 5 is the number of grace. That's how it all begins with us. Even that's how we even get into the program. By God's grace, we are saved through faith. And so it began with grace, supplying salvation and then equipping those to do ministry. Ministers don't hold the faults of others against them and don't view their needs as unnecessary burdens. Now, y'all, I did not say that we don't do that. We do that sometimes. But as we talked a while ago, we're aspiring to get beyond that. We should see the weak because they give us an opportunity to serve in our spiritual gifts. So we should see their weakness as a gift, actually, and serve with the supplies that Jesus gives us. knowing we have something valuable to give them. We must depend on grace for God's supply. Think about if all ministry today was lived out in the manner that Jesus just taught the disciples on how to give grace to people. There would be a fresh spiritual supply for the disciples as well as the people that are ministered to. It would truly be a miracle if that's how ministry happened today. And that, I'm going to stop the recordings there, and then we can talk if y'all want to.